Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our mobile device management, or MDM, for today's remote workforce webinar. With so much of the American population working from home during this pandemic, it's essential now more than ever to ensure that your remote teams are using their devices safely and successfully. So to dive right in, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the company hosting today's webinar, RSI Security. We are headquartered in San Diego, California. We have sales offices in Portland and LA. We are premier managed IT security as well as a compliance advisory service provider. We're a small, medium-sized business with 50 employees and 400 consultants. We are experts at guiding IT security, and we're a leading managed security service provider in California, as well as a PCI, QSA, and ASV company. So to tell you a little bit about Brandon Reed, our speaker for today, Brandon is a technology director and senior IT consultant with over 15 years of experience. He specializes in technology, strategic planning, enterprise architecture, and remote workforce models. He's CompTIA A+, and N+ certified, and is currently obtaining his MBA from Cal State San Bernardino. With this background, Brandon is definitely qualified to address us on mobile device management today, so really looking forward to his presentation. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started and before I pass it off to Brandon. I just want to make all of you guys aware that there will be 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of today's presentation, so we encourage you that if at any time during the presentation you have questions, to use the Q&A box in the little toolbar at the bottom. You can enter questions there, and at the end, Brandon will address them. I also want to let you know that this presentation will be provided to you. The presentation deck will be emailed to you tomorrow, and that's all I have. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to you, Brandon.
Thank you, Ariana. Appreciate the introduction. Thank you for joining us today to talk about mobile device management in today's remote workforce. We've got a lot to cover in the small amount of time we have, so I'll try to keep things as succinct as possible. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to post them and we'll address them at the end. So to take a look at today's agenda, first we're going to talk about MDM in terms of what it actually is and why it's needed. We'll compare some of the solutions that are out there to determine if they're equal or not. We'll talk a little bit about the main players in the MDM space, and then we'll also talk about the two main device configurations, which is COPE, or corporate owned, personally enabled, and BYOD, bring your own device. Then we'll talk a little bit about supervision versus voluntary enrollment, specific to COPE and BYOD, and then we'll get into some best practices and security considerations, first and foremost just around working remotely in general, but then also specific to MDM. We'll do a quick wrap up, talk a little bit about some additional resources, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So what exactly is MDM and why is it needed? Well, in short, mobile device management gives an organization control over basically all of their portable devices. We're talking about laptops, phones, and tablets. This is done through an enrollment process, and once that's completed, almost all of your administration can be done remotely, which is referred to as administration over air. It's very important in today's environment, especially with everybody remote. It's difficult to get things configured correctly when you have to work with people on the phone. So it's always nice to have a MDM solution in place specific to being able to do that remote administration. And this is accomplished through creating configurations, which you can essentially standardize. So you come up with a policy or a series of policies for your devices, and then you can push them out to all of the devices in a one-to-many approach. And again, those policies really allow you to enable and enforce organizational security standards. And then also there's a concept of supervision, which is specific to COPE. We'll talk about that later, but it allows you to automatically provision your devices into your MDM platform simply by executing a purchase order from your mobile carrier. And I want to emphasize too that MDM does support COPE and BYOD. It's not an either or proposition. You can have a mixed bag where some of your devices are COPE and some are BYOD. So why exactly is it needed? Well, for RSI security specifically, one of the most important reasons is that today's compliance standards essentially require you to have administrative control and audit capabilities over your mobile devices. And the reality is that endpoint security and enforcing that security, as well as providing remote administration, really isn't possible without a real MDM platform. And when you get everything set up correctly and you've done education and training, you'll find that employees can easily operate with more efficiency and confidence, knowing that they're operating in a secure manner and they can focus on the work instead of technical configuration and security best practices. And ultimately, MDM really is the prerequisite for a truly mobile workforce if you want that workforce to be efficient, accountable, and secured. So that begs the question, are all MDM solutions equal? Well, the short answer is no. G2, which I've put the source at the bottom here, has a really succinct definition of what actually qualifies as a mobile device management platform within the category. And they've got a series of bullets here that are very straightforward, but really help define the lines between what is actually MDM and what's not. To be considered a mobile device management platform and to be included within that category, any solution you're looking at really needs to be compatible with all common or company issued mobile devices, and it needs to support necessary operating systems and platforms that you have within your business. It definitely needs to function through and with multiple service providers, and you have to have the ability to customize according to your company policies or your requirements. And you need to be able to integrate that platform with existing IT, administrative, and application systems for it to really be effective. It also needs to be able to enable remote configuration, locking, wiping, detection, and encryption of devices. And finally, you need to be able to report on device activity. So what makes MDM confusing for a lot of folks that are trying to enter into the space is understanding the various terms that are out there. There's software and services that are essentially related to mobile device management. Some of them are included with MDM, some of them are separate from MDM, some work with MDM. So it's helpful just to do a quick overview here of what some of these main services are that relate to MDM. The first is mobile application management, or MAM. This is essentially more focused on actual device applications as opposed to the device itself. This is a way for companies to essentially determine which applications are being utilized to access corporate resources, and essentially allows you to determine not only the apps that are in use, but the device itself. So for example, anybody can connect to corporate email with a variety of different mail apps, but if you have a specific app that you want your employees to use, you could use MAM to implement that. It also allows you to restrict access to those services from specific devices as well, which is really important with BYOD. The second is enterprise mobility management, or EMM software. This is sort of a light version of MDM and MAM put together. It's primarily based around organizing and tracking your devices as opposed to actually implementing bona fide security or monitoring performance. So this software works really well for smaller businesses. It's cost effective. You don't have to get involved with a large enterprise solution that may be cost prohibitive. And if those, you have maybe 10, 12 endpoints, but everybody in your organization heavily utilizes those devices, EMM can be a really good solution to get you pretty close to unified endpoint management, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's also endpoint management software. This has actually been around a little bit longer than MDM. If you've ever used an outsourced IT provider, or if you're in a very large company, your IT department inevitably is using some kind of endpoint management software. This also involves installing some kind of an agent on devices, and it allows you to basically remotely monitor and maintain those devices. You can apply patching through automation. You can use the agent to connect to the device to provide remote support. So this is a crucial tool for any provider, and it actually pairs really well with MDM and gives you a little bit of overlap. RSI Security relies heavily on endpoint management software to provide support for our clients, and so this is something that often comes up with respect to MDM and is compared to MDM because it does accomplish similar objectives. But what it will do that MDM doesn't do is it'll give you performance metrics, CPU usage, hard drive space, that kind of stuff. And then finally, we have the unified endpoint management. This is essentially the whole kit and caboodle. We're talking MDM, MAM, EMM, all that kind of stuff is essentially incorporated, but it does it under a single platform. So you can essentially centralize all of your various mobile device software and services under one roof. Very effective for enterprise organizations where you might have endpoints that are numbering in the thousands. Let's talk a little bit about the main players in the MDM space. Essentially, you have third-party vendors and you have major tech companies. And not unlike the evolution of technology in the industry so far, a lot of this starts with third-party vendors that come in to fill spaces and provide solutions for major tech company products that don't necessarily do what is necessary. So a good example would be, Microsoft has XP way back when, but with XP you couldn't actually, mount ISOs without using third-party software. You couldn't burn to a CD or a DVD without third-party software. But eventually Microsoft catches up and they build those features into their operating system. And that's something similar to that has essentially happened here, where you have third-party vendors like Jamf that specializes in Apple automation, Apple mobile device management, and administration. And then eventually Apple comes in and starts to occupy some of that market space with their own solutions, having seen the success of the third-party vendor. And that's essentially what we're looking at here. So Microsoft has come in with Intune, Apple uses Configurator 2, Google has Android Enterprise Management, IBM has MOS 360, including Watson, VMware came in with AirWatch, and then Cisco acquired Meraki, which was a third-party vendor, and utilizes the Systems Manager. And again, this list isn't comprehensive. This is just a sort of a sampling of companies that are in the space. But in terms of third-party vendors, you've got Jamf, Quest Case, which was actually owned by Dell at one point, Manage Engine, Scale Fusion, and then RSI Security uses Sophos MDM for our MDM services. So COPE versus BYOD is always the big debate when you're looking to implement an MDM solution. There's obviously advantages and disadvantages for both, so we'll go over those here just to sort of give you an idea of what to expect if you're thinking about getting into an MDM setup and you're trying to answer this question. So again, COPE means corporate owned, personally enabled. So it's the company owns the devices and gives them out to employees. In terms of advantages, COPE will allow for what's referred to as supervision with your mobile and device vendors. So we'll talk about that in a later slide. And because you have full control over the device, you have end-to-end control. You can determine what apps are allowed and not allowed. You can set policies that apply to the entire phone instead of just the section related to corporate services. Very efficient if you're trying to do large-scale deployments. You can standardize on a device. You can standardize on a policy and a configuration profile and push that out. And as a result, you tend to have decreased employee adoption barriers. When employees know that they're getting a totally separate device that's exclusively used for work, they're definitely put at ease with respect to what the company can and can't see. There's no cross-pollination with their personal device and what they use that device for. And so they tend to be much more receptive to an MDM-based program for that device. In terms of disadvantages, obviously you have to make the capital investment. So the device costs themselves. You have to maintain a corporate mobile fleet, which also includes plans, and sort of the overhead that comes around with that when you're trying to move people between devices, employees that are onboarding and offboarding. And then obviously as a result of that, once you make that investment, you have mobile fleet lifecycle considerations, right? You need to be on top of making sure those devices are up to date and potentially being replaced every 3 or so years. And then as a result of that too, you will have increased device adoption barriers. And what I mean by that is that your employees, you may decide to standardize on an iPhone, but maybe most of your employees are used to using Android or Samsung, right? So as a result, there may be a little bit of a learning curve to actually adopting the device itself. They're just not comfortable working with iOS, but they really it could take them a little time to get used to it. So that's definitely a disadvantage. And obviously, if they're not using the device then you're not maximizing your investment in it, and that could potentially affect productivity and other things. So when it comes to BYOD, there's definitely some advantages, but from our perspective, there are far more disadvantages than advantages. But in terms of what you can expect to gain from a BYOD setup, it's definitely cost effective. Obviously, you don't need to purchase devices or plans. That's handled by the employees because they have their personal devices. And as a result, you have decreased device adoption barriers, really the opposite of what I just said on the previous slide. If they're comfortable using iOS, they're going to get an iPhone. And as a result, they're going to know how to use it just based on the fact that it's part of their everyday life. So it's, there's very few learning curves or hurdles to jump to maximize the use of that device and how it can contribute to their productivity. If you're doing small scale deployments, BYD can be a pretty solid option. If you have a small company, 10 or so employees, it's really not that big a deal to use your own devices. But as you start to scale out, the first thing you'll notice is that it's difficult to do any type of large scale deployment. The second you get to 20 plus devices and you're in a BYOD scenario, it's going to be a nightmare for your IT department to try to tackle that. Not only that, but if those devices, if you have a totally mixed bag, right, 3 or 4 different types of devices, they're going to have to learn how to support that from a technical standpoint. If you standardize on a fleet with a COPE, you can have a sample device in your IT department. They can use that to walk you through on the phone any types of changes. But if they're dealing with very different flavors of operating systems on top of different device types, it can definitely complicate your ability to provide support. Obviously, because the employee owns the device, you have limited endpoint supervision and application controls. There's nothing that you can really do to prevent them from maybe installing another app that might be malicious in nature and try to encroach on the portion of the phone that's being controlled by the company. So that can present some challenges there as well. And obviously, this is especially true in California, but there are legal and human resources challenges to doing a BYOD setup. Privacy concerns, there's new compliance policies coming down the line with respect to privacy, especially in California. So this can all present real challenges. I know there's a lot of HR managers and directors that are pulling their hair out whenever talk about BYOD comes up. Contractors using their own laptops, how do we deal with that? So those are always things that you need to consider, and as a result, constitutes a disadvantage. And then lastly, increased employee adoption barriers. They're going to be very hesitant to enroll their personal device in an MDM platform unless they have a really clear understanding of what it is the company is actually monitoring, what they have control over. So we'll talk about that a little later in the recommendations, but that's definitely something to consider. So let's talk a little bit about supervised versus voluntary enrollment. So even with a COPE setup, for all intents and purposes, the enrollment is voluntary, and it's definitely voluntary if you're talking about a BYOD scenario. But what supervision does is it takes it a step further, and you actually form a relationship between your carrier and the manufacturer of your device. What we're seeing on the screen here is a shot from Verizon's website talking about their device enrollment programs specific to Apple, Samsung, and Google. Apple has what's referred to as Business Manager. It was formerly known as Device Enrollment Program, or DEP. Google Android has Zero Touch Enrollment, and then Samsung has Knox Mobile. And so what you essentially do is you sign up with Verizon, and then you also sign up with one of these companies like Apple. So if you went with Apple, you'd sign up for Business Manager. And what you do is you essentially contract with both of them in such a way that Verizon will start sending device information for any asset you purchase, any mobile asset you purchase through them, will be sent over to Apple's Business Manager. At Apple's Business Manager, you could actually configure a connection to your MDM platform, whatever it might be, and then provide instructions to Apple as to how to deal with new devices that it's made aware of by Verizon. And then Apple will then send that device information to your MDM platform according to your outline. And then once it hits your MDM platform, you'll be notified, and then you can actually apply a policy to that device that's been purchased, so that as soon as the device comes out of the box and is activated, it'll actually reach out. The carrier will direct the device to reach out to your MDM platform for essentially a remote configuration profile. And that's what we're looking at here on the left side here, this remote management. And what that essentially is showing you is the first time you boot up the device, it'll reach out to the carrier and attempt to activate. And when it does, it'll be redirected to your MDM platform. And this is what the end user would see. Just a little quick message saying, hey, my company is going to automatically configure your iPhone. A little bit about what remote management does. And then if you were to hit next on the following screen, you'd be asked to provide credentials. If it's set up correctly, your MDM platform is actually connected to your corporate authentication model. So for example, you could use your email username and password on that screen, and then it would simply assign the device to you and then actually roll out a configuration profile. This can be just simple security settings, or it can be aesthetic changes like the background, but you'll also be enforcing things like password policies. You can actually pre-configure email as well as Wi-Fi set up so that the phone essentially right out of the box boots up and is ready to go. Supervision is a really powerful tool. Not a lot of companies take advantage of it, but they really should be, because it not only makes it easier for your IT department, but it gives you total control over the device. So in a voluntary enrollment scenario, the end user is essentially always the administrator, even though the company might own the phone. So it can become difficult to prevent them from doing things on the phone, specific type of configuration. In some cases, they can even remove the MDM app after it's been installed, which can cause problems. But with a supervision setup, you're basically in total control, and you can decide whether they can even add apps to the phone, whether they can delete apps. So that's what makes it really powerful. So let's talk a little bit about best practices and security considerations. First, we'll start with just working remotely in general. We've had a lot of questions come in over the last few months, especially since the COVID-19 lockdown, because everyone's working from home now, right? So things you used to not have to consider, companies are now suddenly realizing are potential security risks. So these are some common stuff that we essentially advise our clients to take a look at when they come to us with questions about working remotely. First and foremost, whatever your position is and whatever your profile for security is, you want to make sure that you've published or refreshed any of your acceptable use or authorized applications policies, and make sure that you have some verbiage in there that's specific to working remotely. We always recommend including guidelines to employees on how they should approach working remotely with respect to their home internet. This includes things like their Wi-Fi encryption, making sure that the SSID password is complex, etc. So you want to be prepared once you publish these policies to also potentially provide IT support for this if you have an in-house, or work with your outsourced IT provider to make that happen. If only just to get the peace of mind of knowing that your remote employees are operating in a secure manner. You want to make sure that you're backing up whatever your profile is with an actual policy, and that you're also prepared to help folks institute that and adhere to it. We always recommend leveraging some kind of a centralized policy or user account database. For a lot of companies, this might just mean Windows in terms of the server architecture, Active Directory, or Office 365's Azure Active Directory. But again, if you aren't in a Windows model, or you're small enough that you can't really afford an investment in the domain model, there are third-party tools that exist so that you can enforce requirements. MDM will certainly help you do the requirements for your mobile devices, for your tablets, and your phones. But for laptops, you want to make sure that if you don't have a domain model, there's a way to enforce security with respect to password complexity, rotating passwords, etc. And then we tend to prefer issuing corporate-owned devices if feasible when we're talking about laptops and phones here, because again, just based on the benefits and the drawbacks of going with BYOD versus COPE, there's just too much risk in most cases for BYOD, or it takes additional planning, and there are additional considerations that you can essentially scope out or eliminate if you use corporate-owned devices. Again, ensure that you have antivirus, personal firewalls, all the standard stuff enabled on laptops. and any other devices that they might be working with. Most companies are leveraging either a VPN setup or a terminal services setup to get remote access to corporate resources. So if you're going to use VPNs, we always advise to avoid split tunneling, which is essentially selective VPN traffic routing. In a VPN connection setup, you need a way to distinguish between a DNS request that needs to go right out to the internet versus a DNS request that needs to go through the VPN connection. So there can be a tendency for people to want to use split tunneling, but it really is insecure and presents a lot of challenges. So we always advise avoiding that. And then obviously, do not download any company data directly through the VPN. What I'm talking about here is actually grabbing a file off the file server and then dragging it onto your desktop through the VPN connection, maybe working on it locally, saving it, and then dragging it back. Not a good practice. If anything, just open the file directly through the VPN so that you're viewing the file remotely, but it's actually physically located still on the corporate network. And then if you're going to use terminal services, make sure that your remote desktop connections are encrypted and that you have some kind of third-party signed SSL certificate on your terminal servers so that your employees can be confident that you're essentially so that they can be confident that they're actually connecting to your company's resource and not being phished into connecting to a malicious party. Multi-factor authentication, that's been getting a lot of traction in the last few years. It's becoming all that more important. Always make sure that that's enabled for applicable corporate services. We're talking email, any web vendor applications that you might be logging into. Inquire as to whether or not they support MFA, and make sure that it's configured. Obviously, people cracking passwords and pulling email addresses off the internet, which are, for all intents and purposes, user account credentials, make MFA that much more important. We always recommend using encrypted email for sensitive information. There's a variety of ways that you can get email encryption working, but whatever way you choose, make sure that it's simple to use, that it's easy for your employees to discern whether or not they're sending an encrypted email, and then make sure you have documentation and training on that as well, so they understand when they're supposed to encrypt correspondence versus what correspondence might be more benign. Again, secure video conferencing, been in the news recently. Please use passwords on your meetings. A lot of the Zoom kerfuffle had to do with the fact that people were not using passwords on meetings, and so they were getting hijacked, and people were coming in and doing flash mob type stuff. So again, make sure you're enabling your secure video conferencing with passwords and any other strategies like allowing people to come into the meeting, accepting an invite to come in. And then also establish an MDM platform and an appropriate security policy. When we talk about a security policy here, what we're really talking about is aligning with some kind of compliance standard. It's usually the easiest way to do it. You may not, as a company, be subjected to some kind of compliance framework, but even if you aren't, it's always helpful to choose one that's as closely aligned to your industry as possible, standardize on that, and then follow that across the board, right? So if you're in healthcare, it'll likely be HIPAA or something similar to that. If you're in retail, PCI, et cetera. And again, even if you're not required to do so, it always makes it really easy to convey what your security posture is to other companies. Hey, we're PCI, we follow PCID or whatever standard. And then it also puts you in a position where you're essentially following baseline standards, because most of these compliance models overlap heavily. They all prescribe very similar recommendations in terms of security posture. So just picking one and standardizing on is really going to put you in a position to be, where 90% of it is going to be agnostic depending on the actual compliance model. So with respect to MDM, we also have some advice and some recommendations. First and foremost, we always advise that you implement mobile application management. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but this is really important for BYOD scenarios. You want to make sure that you know exactly what applications are being used to access your resources and potentially what devices are actually authorized. So by implementing MAM, you can ensure that people aren't connecting to their email from a phone that you're not aware of, or using, say, Apple's Mail app versus the Outlook app to actually connect to email or other resources. One thing that MDM does include, almost all of them operate under this configuration, but they allow you to create what's called a secure container. And what that does is it carves out an additional encrypted space on the phone that's tied to the MDM app. And that is the location where any corporate files that you might download onto the phone or other types of data are actually stored that are related to the MDM platform. And this is essentially, what happens is the MDM software is monitoring the devices. And if there's ever an issue with the compliance of that device, maybe somebody tries to jailbreak it, or they haven't updated to the most recent operating system, the MDM program can be triggered to actually lock down that container if the device is ever discovered to be not in compliance. And once that container is locked down, everything inside it is not accessible on the phone at all until the phone is pulled back into compliance. So it's really really powerful and really important that you set that up because it adds that extra layer of protection in case the device gets out of the user's hands, or again, there's some kind of compliance requirement that isn't being met. We also recommend diligently maintaining your OS updates and keep a close eye on your mobile fleet life cycle. You want to make sure that phones are being regularly used and updated, and obviously you want to pay attention to how old the phones are getting and be prepared from a budget standpoint as well as from a logistics standpoint to flip the fleet every 3 or so years to reset the life cycle. We always recommend instituting a security awareness and training program for staff. This one's particularly important, especially to me, given my experience with it, because again, when we're talking about adoption barriers, employees have a lot of questions, especially with BYOD. What can you see on my phone? Do you have access to my camera roll? How am I supposed to work with this? What's the criteria for operating as an employee under an MDM framework, and what should I be aware of? So you want to make sure that you give them an opportunity to learn about what it is that you're doing, and you're very clear about what it is that you can and can't see on the device, and what the expectations are for the employee when they're utilizing that device under MDM. Again, whether it's supervised COPE, just COPE, or BYOD, very important to have that. You also want to make sure that training program includes a section about reporting lost or stolen devices. It's always a good idea to do that within 24 hours. It's especially important when it comes to battery life that that IT is made aware that the device might be missing, might be lost, or might be stolen, because you can actually utilize that short time frame while the battery is still running to geolocate the device, potentially wipe it, whatever it is that you need to do. You can always have standing wipe commands and other things that are essentially queued up. So if the device is offline when you send the command, it'll simply queue it up and wait. And if that device ever comes online, it'll get wiped. But if you want that peace of mind of knowing that you've bricked that device or you've located it, and it's just super important. I've worked with employees that have told me, I waited 3 or 4 weeks. I thought it was going to turn up. And there's really not a lot we can do about it at that point. But then I've worked with other employees that let me know right away, and I can actually geolocate it and let somebody know that, hey, you may have left your phone at the Lucky down the street just based on where this GPS coordinate is telling me. And then sure enough, they go and find it that it's in lost and found. So it's always important to make sure that you're incorporating your staff. You're not just mandating and dictating. Give them an opportunity to engage with management, ask questions, and feel confident that everybody has everyone's best interests at heart. And then finally, RSI security can help. Whether you're a large organization, you've got a big in-house IT department, and you're just looking for some consultation and maybe some help with project execution, or maybe you're a smaller organization and you're looking to actually outsource your MDM services. We provide both types of assistance to clients. We'd be happy to get involved, give you a consultation, or potentially take on the actual configuration, deployment, and ongoing management of your MDM services. All right, so to wrap it up, if you're thinking about pursuing an MDM solution and you're trying to figure out where to start, these are some helpful starting points, whether you're working with COPE or BYOD. If you're going to go with corporate-owned, personally enabled, especially with supervision, the first piece of advice is to contact your cellular carrier, Verizon, AT&T, et cetera, and just inquire about what their manufacturer supervision options are. It's always helpful to understand what they're going to support, and then you can take that information into the next step where you can actually inventory your current devices, and based on what your disposition is, decide on a device type. We typically recommend standardizing on just one, like iPhone or Android. You can certainly do a mixed bag, but just know that you're going to have to contract with potentially with multiple manufacturers, right? You'll have to sign up with Apple's Business Manager if you use iPhones, with Google if you're using Android. So if you decide that you're going to standardize on 2 or more device types, just know that you're going to add some additional overhead there, because you'll have to sign up for 2 separate portals. And then at that point, you're in a position to set up an appropriate MDM solution. And again, this is going to be based on your supervision method, your device type, and your authentication model. Very important that if it's feasible and you have a centralized user account database model, that you find an MDM solution that will work well with that. With Sophos MDM, you can tie it to Active Directory, right, and a few other different solutions. And when you do that, you essentially eliminate the need to have an additional database of usernames and passwords that are just specific to MDM. And instead, employees can use the credentials that they're already working with as part of that MDM solution. And then one of the last steps is to establish supervision with your carrier and your manufacturer. You essentially contract, get everything configured and set up. And then once you have all that in place, you actually register your MDM platform with the manufacturer. So Apple Business Manager or whatever solution you go with, you register the platform and then create the criteria for pushing purchase device information to the MDM platform. For BYOD, it's a little simpler. First thing we recommend is to poll your employees for device types. So find out who's using what. And then ultimately you're looking for an MDM solution that will support as many of those device types as possible. And again, your user authentication model. If people are still working with flip phones, they're probably not going to be able to participate in an MDM program. But for the most part, everybody's using smartphones these days. So it's just a matter of figuring out what the majority of your workforce is using. So that way, again, your device adoption will be mitigated in terms of barriers. And then set up your appropriate MDM solution. You want to make sure it supports the device types that you have the majority of in your authentication model. And then finally, we always recommend deciding if there's going to be some kind of reimbursement model. It's always helpful to at least give a $20 to $40 stipend to employees on a monthly basis to compensate them for allowing the company to use their personal devices. And it's a gesture of goodwill, if anything. So we always recommend looking into that.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for that presentation. I know I learned a lot. So before we get to the question and answer portion of our webinar, I just want to go over a few resources that we'll be emailing you tomorrow. While I review this slide, I encourage you guys, we don't have any questions at this point, so please submit any questions that you want Brandon to go over. So just as a recap, tomorrow I'll be emailing you this presentation deck along with a link to request a consultation if you're interested in learning more about how we might be able to help you with your MDM efforts, along with a discount offer. As a thank you for attending today's webinar, we're offering a 10% discount on our MDM services through the end of May. So if you're looking to get some help, you might want to take advantage of that. And then lastly, we'll be sending you a certificate awarding you with your 1 continuing professional education or CPE credit earned for attending today's webinar. So like I said, you should get that by tomorrow. If you don't get the email by tomorrow afternoon, please feel free to email marketing@rsisecurity.com, because I know sometimes the email can get caught up in the spam filter or whatever. So just shoot us an email and I can get you all that information. So yeah, I will pass it back to you, Brandon, for the question and answers. I don't see any, so maybe we can give it a minute or two to see if any questions come through.
Absolutely. A lot of information, so.
Yeah.
All right then. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this webinar. Good luck to everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. And again, I appreciate you joining me for this presentation on mobile device management in today's remote workforce.